was a British Dutch KGB agent. So he started off as a British spy and then he became a double agent. He started working for the KGB. And 20 years ago or so, I read an article about him in a Dutch magazine. Blake, like me, grew up British in Holland, so we had that in common. And I read this about this man and I thought, wow, this guy, he has this amazing life story. Now we'd say, I've learned to say, he's a one-man Netflix series. And I thought one day when I'm in Moscow, I want to interview this man. And in 2012, I was going to Moscow for a conference. So we had a mutual friend, happily, a Dutchman in Moscow called Derek Sauer. So I said to Derek, I'm coming to Moscow. Do you think you could set me up with an interview with Blake? I'd love to write just one article about him. And Derek asked Blake, and when I was in Moscow, Blake actually phoned me to interview me first. This is good advice. If you're ever asked by a journalist for an interview the journalist first and see what he wants. That's what Blake did. So I'm walking around this graveyard in Moscow looking for the graves of Khrushchev and Chekhov. And this former KGB agent calls me up. And we have a very pleasant chat in Dutch. And he wants to establish, I'm not going to ask him about Putin because Blake detests Putin, but he doesn't want to talk about this in an interview because he depends on Putin for his dacha and his pension. So I reassure him, no, I just want to talk about your spying career, Mr. Blake. And so he invites me to his dacha outside Moscow the next day. And Derek Sauer sends his personal driver. We go through the Saturday traffic jams in Moscow. And then before me is this little man, at that point, nearly 90 years old, with his doggie, Lucia, and his wife, not on this picture, Ida. And they welcome me into their home, where I then spend 3 or 4 hours talking to Blake and interviewing him and walk out at the end thinking, that was the most interesting interview I have done in my journalistic career.
So you were quite taken by Blake, as I recall.
Yeah, if you recall, when I flew home from Moscow that day, I said to you, I've interviewed this man, he's amazing, he's so nice and interesting and intellectual and thoughtful, and he's got this fantastic life story. And when I told it to you, you said he seemed to have sent 40 odd British agents to their deaths by betraying.
I said, didn't he kill 40 people?
Yeah, I mean, and so in the book, having had time to reflect on the interview and spend years researching his life, I say essentially he's a well-meaning guy who became a serial killer. So having escaped from his charm, and of course the similarities between him and me in terms of maybe background, origins, I was able to see him more clearly, thanks to you.
But you decided that you wanted to write a book about him, but you had to sort of make a deal with his handlers in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, my original agreement with Blake was he said, don't write about me in English, please, because my ex-wife, who's very traditional and conservative in Britain, and my 3 sons, whom I all deserted when I escaped from jail in 1966 to go to Moscow, they don't really like it when their dad, the KGB agent, is always outed in the British media. But he said, write about me in Holland, that will be nice. So that was the agreement which I fully planned to do that day in 2012 when I saw him. But a couple of years later, when the kids were finally old enough that I didn't spend every second of the weekend with them and I had time to think about a book, I thought I'd really like to write this book in English. So I approached our mutual friend, Derek Sauer. And Derek said, look, let it come out when he dies. Because when he dies, there's going to be a lot of publicity worldwide anyway. And so his family will be dealing with that. So your book won't make a difference to the publicity. So
you weren't allowed to publish the book until he died. So the book has been done for several years in a drawer, sort of waiting for this 90-something-year-old man to.
Yeah, I mean, I finished the book originally in 2017 when I think Blake was 95. And as the years ticked on, I thought maybe he's going to outlive me. And so I'd left enough instructions for the publishers to be able to publish even if he did outlive me. But then on Boxing Day 2020, soon after I'd had so much time, I was able to revise the finished manuscript by then. Boxing Day 2020, I get an email from the Dutch publisher saying, have you seen? He's died. And so my kind of post-Christmas somnolence, mid-pandemic nothing to do-ness dissolves into a flood of overwork for the next couple of weeks.
I seem to recall that flood of overwork, and I was minding the ship. So let's start with the story of Blake and start really at the beginning. He was born in Rotterdam in 1922. What sort of family was Blake born into?
Well, Blake's mother is a Dutch Protestant, quite upper middle class, established Rotterdam family. And his father is an oddball because his father is a Jew from Constantinople called Albert Bihar, who in World War One had fought for the French Foreign Legion and then the British Army. And, he'd been quite badly wounded in the war. He'd inhaled gas into his lungs during a gas attack. And he'd got British citizenship, although he seems to have spent almost none of his life in Britain. And at the armistice, the British sent him to Rotterdam to help repatriate British prisoners of war returning from Germany, I guess. And in Rotterdam, he meets Blake's mother, falls in love with her, tells her that he's British, doesn't mention that he's Jewish, and they have a son, George.
Oh, so even the wife didn't know he was Jewish, let alone the son.
Not sure the wife knew. He always had figured out quite quickly that his mother-in-law was not keen on her daughter marrying a Jew. So in Rotterdam, he always presented himself as a kind of British gentleman, and he later founded a sports shop called the British Sports House, which sounded very kind of posh and appealing to Dutch ears. And so Blake grows up while his father is alive, thinking my father is British and my mother is Dutch.
Okay, but Blake kind of barely, the father spoke English to Blake, but Blake barely spoke English. They had a sort of, what was the language of the home?
George Behar, and as he was then, and his sisters speak very little English or not enough. And so one of Blake's traumas is as his father is dying when Blake is 12, 13, dying of the wounds he had in the World War I, the gas he'd inhaled. At one point, his father says to him, George, can you close the curtains? And George can't understand the command. And I think his obsessive learning of languages later maybe stems from this kind of childhood inability to communicate properly with his father, whom he loved very deeply. But Blake, throughout his life, would remain a mummy's boy.
Okay. And he was also a Calvinist. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So Blake grew up in this pre-war, very pious Holland. You still see vestiges of that actually in the American Midwest in towns like Holland, Michigan, where, for example, Betsy DeVos's family is from. And I think there's towns like that in Iowa as well, where you have this very strict Calvinism. On Sundays, you're not allowed to do anything. And in the strictest form of Calvinism, which Blake followed, everything is predetermined. We humans have no free will. God decides everything we do. We're mere instruments in his hands. And so that was very much Blake's worldview all his life into his death, that we humans have no control over our actions.
So Blake's dad dies when he's 11, 12 years old?
12 or so, yeah.
12 or so. And a letter arrives from an aunt in Cairo saying Blake should come here. Can you tell us about that chapter of his life?
Yeah, so the family had been left destitute. I mean, the father's business had done badly after the Great Depression, and this is 1935 when he dies. And clearly he's told his soon-to-be widow, look, when I die, write to my sister, she'll help you out. The sister is married to a very wealthy banker in Cairo, and they live in this fantabulous mansion there. It's a Jewish family, French-speaking, the Courier family, which may be known. This is their mansion, which is now actually the Algerian embassy in Cairo on Zamalek, I believe, which those of you who know Cairo, I think, will know. And it's one of the landmarks of the city. So Blake is sent to Cairo for 3 school years. He lives in this mansion. It's quite a modest house by the standards of the local European upper class. They only have 10 or so servants. And he goes to the British school, learns English, goes to the French school, learns French. He becomes, in these years, a cosmopolitan. And he kind of realizes that he also has this Jewish heritage. It's a very Jewish household. His older cousin, Henri Courier, who will later become a kind of famous French leader of resistance movements in the Third World. He funds and helps resistance movements all over the world, starting with the FLN. He is living in this house and he's becoming a communist, and he, no doubt, is an influence on George.
But then he goes back to Rotterdam to visit his mom, and that sort of coincides with the start of World War II.
Yeah, so he, I think, goes home in the holidays by boat. And in September 1939, he's about to go back to Cairo for the next school year when World War II breaks out. So they say, okay, George, better stick around in Rotterdam, be safe with your family. Holland will probably be neutral anyway. We don't fight wars. And then in May 1940, there's the terrible bombardment of Rotterdam, which he survives with a kitchen pan over his head under the table in the family home. And the Germans invade. So at this point, the Germans invade. He's 17 years old. He's a part Jewish Briton. He's interned briefly, then he's released. And then he goes underground. His mother and his sisters go to England on the last boat, and he joins the Dutch resistance. He becomes a courier goes around the country looking like a schoolboy, but really delivering secret newspapers and secret documents.
Wow. So how was he actually recruited into the resistance?
Well, I mean, Blake was always very close to the church, and he knew this particular pastor who was anti-German, and the pastor in the end sets him up with a resistance group, the resistance group Vrij Nederland, which is still the name of a Dutch magazine that stemmed from that resistance group. And Blake works for them for a couple of years, but it's very small beer. I mean, in the Netherlands, there's no mountains, there's no forests, so the resistance is kind of hiding in plain sight. It can't really do much. And mostly what it does is spread these newspapers, these kind of anti-Hitler newspapers. And Blake gets frustrated with this. And so in 1942, when he's nearly 20, he decides, you know what, I'm going to go to Britain and become a real agent. Britain is a superpower. I am British. And obviously he had these kind of, he'd grown up with this desire, like many spies have, to be a secret power influencing the doings of the world. And that
So he's developing a taste for espionage at this point. He likes doing things in secret. And now he has these languages.
I mean, there's not many people who start the espionage life younger than Blake did. I mean, he's 17, 18 when he gets into this. And so deception becomes a daily habit for him. You know, at one point he's by a tram stop and all the secret newspapers fall out from under his sweater. A German officer is standing beside him, an older man, and Blake is terrified, but this officer kindly helps him pick up the newspapers, perhaps knowing what they really are, and gives them back to him. So he is kind of dicing with danger, maybe not death, possibly death every day.
So he wants to hit the big time in terms of intelligence, and he goes to London. And what happens then?
Well, he makes this amazing journey. It's the first of 2 escapes that he would make through Europe, unaided. He escapes in 1942-3 through Belgium and France under occupation, gets into Franco's Spain, there is briefly imprisoned again, but gets on a boat to Britain, and he arrives in Britain, and partly to see his mummy and partly to join the British Secret Services. And amazingly, because you can't just kind of knock on the door of the British Secret Intelligence Service and say hello, amazingly, after a brief stint in the Navy, I think we have a picture of him in his Navy gear.
Yes, just one sec.
He is recruited by the British Secret Service, and he's interviewed by a British officer who speaks fluent Dutch with a British accent in Dutch, and is then recruited into P8, which is the Dutch section of the Secret Service, because at that time there's a Norwegian section, a French section, all the occupied countries. There are often led by British people who have lived in France, lived in Czechoslovakia, speak the language fluently, and are trying to manage the resistance there.
So his job is to help out Dutchmen who are going to be parachuted back into Holland to help the resistance there.
That's one of his tasks. Young men like him, he has to check before they get on the plane for this incredibly dangerous mission, whether, for example, they have London cinema tickets in their pockets, which would give them away, and these things happen, or British clothing items. And then if they make it into Holland, they then send back often very garbled radio messages. You know, this is all pretty amateurish, often hard to understand. And he has to try and figure out which building they're telling him is occupied by Germans and needs to be bombed and so on. So he, at this very young age, in his early 20s, is playing a role in the British war effort. He's very proud of it. He's very proud of how Britain, you know, shows its kind of staunchness and stoicism during World War II.
And is he still religious at this point?
Yeah, so Blake still thinks, well, when the war is over, I'm going to be a Calvinist pastor. But what changes is the war ends, and first he's sent back to the liberated Netherlands to kind of, you know, oversee the post-war stuff. And then he's sent on to Germany, which is being occupied by Allied forces, including the Brits. There's one photo where the soldier behind General Montgomery, as Montgomery receives the German surrender in May 1948, is said to be George Blake. I'm not sure that's true, but he is anyway. He's right there in the action. And the thing about being in the occupied forces in Germany is there's a lot of kind of wine, women, and song available, because, you know, the Germans are completely bankrupt. The Allied forces occupy the finest mansions. They are the kind of heroes in town, or the kind of rulers. In Holland, when they were occupying, they were the heroes. So there's a whole lot of temptation on offer. There's a lot of partying every night. There's a lot of looting of stocks of liquor in aristocratic mansions. And so after about a few months of this partying in 1945, Blake is very ashamed of himself. and he feels, I'm not worthy to be a pastor anymore. I have succumbed to temptation. I need to find another vocation. And that's when SIS says, George, you know, you're a good chap. You speak your languages. Why don't you join us on the permanent staff?
So the SIS gives him a permanent job. Someone was asking in chat, he's so young, how could he be in the resistance that young? But it wasn't unusual for teenagers to be in the resistance during the war, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no kind of official recruitment process. He had turned 18, and you know, you must remember that in World War II, in that era, most people were starting work as teenagers. So it's not at all unusual to, at 18, be doing a responsible job. I mean, 18-year-olds are doing a lot of the fighting as well. But it's true that he has this very deep grounding in secret work from an early age.
And he's hired by the British Secret Service, even though, I mean, he's sort of barely British, but they assume that he's going to be loyal to them.
Well, I mean, what helps is that his father had had a good war. I mean, this is how people thought at the time. His father had had a good war in World War One. George had had a good war in World War Two. And a lot of British careers, really from the whole period from, say, 1918 until the 1980s, 90s, are built on having had a good war. And George had been totally loyal to Britain in World War II. But what the British didn't understand was that it wasn't because he was a British patriot, which he never really was, but because he was anti-Nazi. So when the war ceases to be against the Nazis, and from already in 1945, the British and Americans start fighting the Cold War. So even before World War II is over, they're starting to focus on the new enemy, which is the Soviet Union. And there, Blake is less excited to be part of this struggle. I mean, in Germany, for example, he has to manage German naval officers and get them to spy in the East German zone, the Soviet zone. So he is working with men, many of whom are former Nazis, and getting them to spy on the Soviets, who until months ago were allies of Britain. And he feels very queasy about this. So he's not on board with the new Cold War from the start.
Okay, and then he's given a book to read about communism to learn how terrible communism is.
Yeah, this is one of the very funny British establishment aspects to me of the book. There's a lot of screw-ups by the British establishment. And so one is this bloke in SIS, Carew Hunt, writes a book, The Theory and Practice of Communism, which is meant to say communism is the enemy. You need to understand communism properly. So read this book and then you'll know what we're fighting. So Blake reads the book and thinks, communism sounds very good to me. It's a lot like Calvinism. They want to bring paradise, but they want to bring it on earth. And like the Calvinists, they believe in equality. They don't like material excess. I find this quite a convincing picture.
So it backfired. And then they sent him he hadn't been to university, so they sent him to Cambridge for a year to learn Russian. What happens there?
Well, Cambridge famously is where all the best KGB agents are educated, and starting with the Cambridge Five in the 1930s, who Blake would later meet. And he does a year of Russian, and he's a prodigy with languages. In Cairo, he'd already learned quite a bit of Arabic. He spoke English, French, German, Dutch. And he fires on with Russian, and he claims that within a couple of months, he can read Anna Karenina in Russian. And his inspirational teacher, this, I have to say, insane woman, Elizabeth Hill, is a very big factor in his life. Elizabeth Hill, she's very right-wing. She grew up in Petersburg before the revolution in this kind of community of British-Russian merchants. Father is British, mother Russian. And when the revolution happens, these merchants all flee back to Britain. And so she speaks fluent Russian. She loves Russia. She loves Orthodox Church. She hates communism, and she brings George along to Orthodox church services in London, and he's captivated by the music, by the chants, and so he starts to fall in love, not with communism so much as with Russia.
And then he ends up getting sent to Korea.
Yeah, so the British sort of randomly sent him to Korea. Blake is very disappointed. He's much more interested in the Middle East. But he's sent to Korea, and they said, well, you must start building up an agent network in Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, because it's only 450 miles from Seoul. But that's on the map. In fact, there's no way to get from Seoul to the Soviet Union, and there's North Korea in between, so Vladivostok might as well be on the moon. So he gets very frustrated in Korea. He thinks the South Korean regime is very corrupt, this kind of pro-American regime of the kind we later become familiar with in Vietnam. The Minister of Education has a photograph of Hitler in his room, so George gets very disaffected. But the British say to him, look, don't worry, there's going to be a war soon. We, Britain, will remain neutral, and your job there will be to observe the war for us. And so he says, okay. And then in June 1950, the North Koreans duly invade Seoul, but Britain then enters the war. against what he'd been told. Britain, it turns out, has by then become an American lackey. America needs it in the war, so Britain does what the US says. So Blake realizes, A, I'm not working for a superpower anymore. I'm working for this second-rate power that is kind of an American poodle. And B, I'm in deep trouble now because I'm an enemy alien in Seoul. So the North Koreans pick him up and the other British and French diplomats, and they take them on this dreadful death march with American POWs and with many of the missionaries who were in Korea at the time. March these people from Seoul up north, and on the march, hundreds of people die. Blake emerges as a hero, helping people who can't walk anymore, giving his coat to a nun, so he himself is freezing. And in the end, when the horrors, and on the way, very importantly, they see American bomber planes, super fortresses, destroying Korean villages. And Blake is horrified by this. This is kind of what is a kind of run preview of Vietnam. Blake thinks, why are we, the West, in this country where people should choose what they want to be and do? Why are we destroying this country? We shouldn't be here. And so he's in the Cold War, and the Cold War has turned hot, but he's starting to change side.
And so he ends up in this farmhouse for 2 years, where he's with 8 other people, and they sort of have nothing to read and nothing to do.
Yeah, he's with 8 men. There are 2 women further up, but he's with 8 men, diplomats and journalists, highly intelligent men, and they're just bored out of their minds. So they start by telling each other their life stories, for every kind of detail of their life stories. But after 3 months, they're done and they have to start again. And they do all these reenactments of events. They do this play acting. So Blake is ennobled by the others. They proclaim him, first they proclaim him a knight of the British Empire, and then they make him a lord and so on. So they play all these games. They're bored out of their minds, very little to eat. And one day a parcel of books arrive from the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and they draw lots about who gets to read it first, and then they reread and reread and read it endlessly until the book is in pieces. And 2 books in Russian, translation of Marx's Capital and Lenin's State and Revolution. Only 2 of them can read Latin, Blake and the former British consul in Seoul, Vivian Holt. And so they sit on this grave hill reading Marx. They read Capital twice in Russian, which is an amazing achievement if you think about it. And they discuss it. And Blake is very influenced by British establishment figures like Carew Hunt, the author of that book, like Elizabeth Hill, his teacher in Cambridge, and now by Vivian Holt. And Holt says to him, look, I'm very sad to say, but I think the British Empire is done for, and it's going to be overtaken by something more modern, and I think that's communism. Communism is the future. So Blake is very persuaded by this and by Marx, and he decides, right, I'm a communist. And one day he hands the North Korean camp commander, whom they call Fatso, fat-shaming nickname that we would now think which is wrong. He hands Fatso a note to hand to the Soviet embassy. Pretty soon a KGB agent shows up, discreetly interrogates Blake.
At this farmhouse in Korea where they're all being held.
At this tiny farmhouse in North Korea in a place called Manpo, if you're over there. And Blake is recruited to the KGB.
So that's when Blake officially kind of becomes a double agent.
Yeah, we're now in 1951, 1952. Yeah.
Okay, so then he's repatriated. I think we have a picture back finally to the UK. I think we have a...
Yeah, so triumphantly the prisoners come home. The British prisoners, they've been bought clothes by the Koreans and the Chinese. They're very smartly dressed. They've had a train journey essentially from the Chinese border all the way to Europe. And here they are, welcomed by a huge crowd. And Blake, who's the guy with the pointy black beard at the left of that bottom picture, very dapper he was when he was younger. And with these missionaries who, big part, this is why Koreans are now often Christians. He comes home, hero's welcome. He
comes triumphantly home, but now he's a KGB spy. I think we also have a picture of him with his, let's see if I can.
With his mother, yeah, this very Dutch-looking matron, who of course is there, and on this happy day. And Blake says, as I descended the airplane steps, I knew I was no longer who they thought I was.
So then Blake starts working for the SIS in London. No one suspects him at that point.
Yeah, I mean, the British establishment is really dreadfully naive because this is 1953. In 1951, 2 senior British officials, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, disappear, get a ferry to France, and then show up in Moscow. They have turned out to be KGB agents who've been working for the KGB in Britain for many years. So this man comes back, an agent of yours comes back from North Korean captivity maybe you should check out whether he's been turned. So the SIS just have a couple of days of chats with him, and they, good chat, Blake, and go away on holiday for a few months, take a bit of a rest, come back. When he comes back, he starts to, when his colleagues go out at lunchtime, he has a camera strapped between his legs every day, a mini camera. And he takes out his camera and he photographs secret documents. And every couple of weeks, he will meet his KGB handler, Sergei Kondrashev, on the top of a London bus or in a deserted suburban train station and hand over the stuff.
Yeah, Martin Slachter asked a very good question, which is, how did the Soviets know that they could trust him?
That is a very good question. So Nikolai Lyanko, who interrogates him, says, well, write out the organizational structure of MI6, which is what SIS is now being called now. MI6 is British kind of CIA. Write out the organizational structure, what every bit of it does. And Blake does it. And they compare it with the organizational structure that had been drawn for them by Kim Philby, who is another very famous British defector to the KGB. And Philby's structure and Blake's structure match. And that proves to them that Blake, that's the main piece of evidence they have, that Blake is for real.
Okay. And so he's photographing secret documents during his lunch hour. He's getting his hands on all kinds of material. And then he hits the kind of mother lode. What was that?
Well, the British and Americans really want to know what the Soviet Union is planning. Do the Soviets want war or not in these years after Stalin? We're talking 1954 or so. And really, they have no idea what the Soviets are up to. The British and Americans have no human intelligence anywhere near the Kremlin. And so they have this brilliant scheme. We're going to dig a tunnel under Berlin, from West Berlin to East Berlin. Berlin is kind of the center of the Cold War. And then we can tap Soviet phone calls, especially Soviet army in Berlin, because the great fear is that the Soviets are planning a Hiroshima, kind of, let's say, a nuclear bomb on New York, or they're planning a Pearl Harbor, a sudden attack on US military somewhere, or they're going to invade, their troops suddenly pour out of East Germany into Western Europe. And so the Allies want to listen, or the Western Allies want to listen to the Soviet phone calls to get even a few hours warning of a Soviet attack. That can be the difference between the salvation of Western life or not.
So this is a tunnel under East Berlin?
Yeah, it's dug in a kind of a kilometer, a few hundred meters or so from West Berlin under East Berlin, so they can tap the lines. But the man who is deputed to take the minutes at the first meeting to set up the tunnel, unfortunately, is George Blake. So within a few days, the Soviets have full information on the tunnel, the KGB does. And now the KGB has this terrible dilemma, which is, do we just say, we know the tunnel's there and we stop it? Because then the British and Americans will know, well, who betrayed the tunnel? And they might decide, well, that was Blake. And then the KGB will lose their prime asset inside MI6, Blake. And so the KGB decides, you know what, we're just going to protect Blake. We're going to let the Americans dig their tunnel, and we're going to let it happen, because we care more about Blake than we care about the phone calls, essentially, of the Soviet military. So the KGB kind of screw the Soviet military in order to protect Blake. So the Allies have a year of listening to Soviet military phone calls, which are completely authentic. The Soviets talking have no idea that the West is listening in. Even KGB calls, many people in the KGB have no idea the West is listening in. And so the West gets this incredibly valuable information. And what is the information? A lot of the phone calls are about sex. A lot of them are in such obscene language that the transcribers have to draw up this lexicon of obscene Soviet terminology, Russian terminology. And a lot of the phone calls are about how stupid Soviet command is. And the great...
But interestingly, they're not planning an attack on the West.
Yes, that's the reassuring thing. There is no sign of troop movements. There is no sign of anything big being cooked up. It turns out that the Soviets are just kind of, happy to hang around in Berlin doing nothing. And so this is crucial information. And only after a year or so, in spring 1955, does the KGB kind of finally discover, as it were, the tunnel.
Okay. But Blake, by this point, is living in Berlin, in West Berlin.
Yeah, Blake has been sent to Berlin. So he's kind of, by this point, he's no longer working on the tunnel, but he's a bit anxious. But anyway, the KGB manages to discover the tunnel without exposing him. Later, he's sent back to London. And by now, the MI6 is starting to suspect. They know we have a mole, as it's called. We have an internal spy. And they have a list of about 10 names, one of whom is Blake, who could be the spy, could be the mole.
Okay.
And then, so they start to get suspicious of Blake, and they send him to Lebanon to learn Arabic on this Arabic course to get him out of the way of any secrets. And then a Pole called Mikhail Golonyevsky defects to the West. Golonyevsky is quite a spectacular character with a big handlebar moustache. Later, he will say that he is Tsar Alexei, or he's the son of Grand Duke Nicholas. He's the last living Romanov, etc. So he goes a bit mad. But anyway, he gives the British enough information to show that Blake is the mole. This is confirmed by another couple of defectors. So the Brits know it's Blake. Okay. Blake is now in Lebanon. So the station chief there, Nicholas Elliott, kind of accidentally bumps into him at a theatre performance and says, "Oh, George, haven't you heard you're wanted back in London? They want to talk to you about a promotion. You should go there. It's good news."
Someone asked on chat, Simon, I think this is an interesting question. When he was sent to study Arabic in Lebanon, did he suspect that he was maybe under suspicion?
I think when you're a mole, you always suspect you're under suspicion. You always think my time is running out. And the way the time is most likely to run out is a defector from the East giving you away. Okay. And he is getting, he has a young family by now. He's married Gillian, who was a secretary in SIS. They have 2 boys and another boy on the way.
And he initially didn't want to marry Gillian because he thought he would be found out eventually.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't want to get married because the life of a double agent is typically short. And you don't want to, bring down your wife, who is a very conservative person and anti-communist, and any future children in your fall. But, Gillian sort of, is so convincing. She finally persuades him to marry her. And he thinks, oh, well, might as well.
And they have 3 kids or 2 kids and another one on the way when they're all together in Lebanon.
Yeah, and Blake is thinking of, joining an oil company and getting out of the secret world. And he feels his time is coming to an end. And then he is called back to London. He has this terrible dilemma. Do I just escape through Syria to the Soviet Union? In which case I'd have to ask my wife, tell my wife I'm a KGB agent, ask her to come with me to the Soviet Union. She'd probably say no. My family is then destroyed. Or do I go back to London and hope for the best, hope that they really are just giving me a promotion? This isn't about unmasking me. So he arrived back in London at St. James's Park at the office there. And he meets his colleague, Harry Shergold, at the door. And I said to Blake, what did you feel at this point? And we were speaking in Dutch, but he breaks into English and he said, I felt the game is up. So Shergold says, oh, hello, Blake. Let's walk over to Cadogan Place, which is where the main office is. And Blake realizes they're taking me there because they can record the interrogation there. And indeed, at Cadogan Place, he is interrogated by 3 of his colleagues, one of whom he's very chummy with. And for 2 days, Blake denies. And every evening he goes back to stay with his mother in Radlett in Hertfordshire. He's not allowed to tell her, but in a very British way, he's not allowed to tell he's being interrogated, but in a very British way, he's allowed to stay with his mum, although MI6 do take the precaution of tailing him every evening. And on the 3rd day, MI6 is thinking, well, we know he did it, but we can't prove it. Maybe pretty soon we'll just say to him, Blake, get on a plane to Moscow. We never want to see you again. When they say to him, well, it wasn't your fault. You were tortured by the North Koreans. You had to do it. You had no choice. We don't blame you. And Blake is outraged because the thing he's most proud of in his life, he's an idealist. He's a Calvinist. He becomes a communist purely out of idealism. He didn't do it for money. And so he bursts out angrily, nobody tortured me. Nobody made me do it. I did it of my own accord, of my own will. And so the interrogators are flabbergasted. He's confessed for no particular reason. And then he spills all the beans, tells them everything they want to know. And then foolishly, not realizing this probably wouldn't stand up in court, an interrogation inside the Secret Service, he then confesses to the police as well.
And then they call his wife and tell his wife that she was married to a spy, to a double agent.
Yeah, somebody goes around to Gillian in Lebanon and says, well, we have rather bad news. It turns out that George is a KGB agent. And she says, never for a moment did I think, oh, that's a terrible mistake. You've got the wrong man. She said, I immediately thought, yes, that's right. I knew it explains everything. It's why he's friendly but doesn't have friends. It's why you can never fully get through to him. It's the caution he has, the times he disappears. He is a KGB agent.
So he is tried and sentenced to prison
Yeah.
in Britain.
So there is he later explains to the Stasi, the Stasi, East German secret police archives, are one of my best sources. He gave a lot of talks there in his later years as a kind of Eastern European spy hero. He explains to the Stasi, it's a very British trial in the sense that it's sort of fair play. He really admires Britain. He's an Anglophile. He admires its gentlemanly fair play. He's in court. He admits that there are no particular mitigating circumstances. He admits he did it. And then the judge gives him a 42-year sentence, which is the longest in modern British history. So there are gasps in the courtroom. People are aghast. And the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, notes in his diary a very savage sentence. And in fact, it wasn't.
Did they say in the court that he was responsible for potentially the deaths of 40 people?
This evidence was not presented in court because when you're a Secret Service, you don't want to admit stuff like this in court. So a lot of it couldn't even be told officially in the courtroom, even in secret session. So Justice Parker, it seems, broke the rules of fair play. And the night before sentencing, he calls Macmillan. It's a very British old boys moment. He calls the Prime Minister, it seems, and he says, how bad is the damage that Blake did before I decide on the sentence? And that is completely against the rules. If you're an English judge, you're, I suppose, a judge in other countries as well, you are not supposed to discuss cases under your consideration, and certainly not with the Prime Minister. So Parker gives him 42 years, and the supposition internally is it's a year for every agent's life lost. Blake had betrayed several hundred agents, of whom about 40 were probably killed.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. And then the Brits have to go to the Americans and say, oops.
Yeah, just in answer to a question I see on screen, these 40 agents were mostly not British. They were Eastern Europeans working behind the Iron Curtain. They were largely East Germans and Russians and people in the Balkan working for MI6 behind the Iron Curtain. So the British are very embarrassed because they've had a lot of spy scandals constantly, Philby, McLean, Burgess, and then a whole string of lesser known because working class or lower middle class people working in the embassy in Russia have turned out to be KGB agents. So every time it's a huge embarrassment, they have to tell the Americans, oops. But luckily for the Brits, Blake is exposed a month after the Bay of Pigs disaster, where the CIA helps these Cuban exiles in this sort of crackpot attempt to invade Cuba. Biggest intelligence disaster in sort of recent American history at the time. And so when the Brits say to them, well, it's rather embarrassing, George Blake, the Americans don't really have a leg to stand on. Kennedy can't really beat them about the head for this. So the Brits get away with this, but the Americans do say to each other, never, ever trust those English people again.
So Blake is put into the perfectly named Wormwood prison. Is that
Wormwood Scrubs?
Wormwood
a name
Scrubs.
that elicits sympathy with the inmates, yes. So he is sent to Wormwood Scrubs notionally for 42 years. So he would be there until 2003. And he becomes this kind of the most beloved man in the prison. Finally, he can live as himself. He doesn't, everyone now knows he's a communist and a secret agent. So for the first time in his life, he doesn't have to pretend, and he becomes this warm, friendly bloke that I met as well. The other prisoners are largely working class or underclass, and he teaches young men French and German. He has Arabic classes. One of the prisoners makes a book stand for his Quran, which he enjoys reading. And he is really the life and soul of the prison. The wardens point to men who are struggling and say, that man is doing 42 years. What have you to worry about? But meanwhile, Blake is constantly plotting his escape. He does not plan to spend his life there. He wants to get out. And so he finds this Irish prisoner soon to be released, Sean Burke, who will help him on the outside. And then these British pacifists who have been jailed for trespassing on American Air Force property during the ban the bomb movement. And they arrange Blake's escape. And so what happens is a burglar on the inside breaks a window pane for Blake, and he gets to the top of that wall that you can see there. And then Sean Burke, this Irish ex-prisoner, throws up a rope ladder. But unfortunately, Burke doesn't attach anything for Blake to attach the rope ladder to.
So he's just holding a rope ladder at the top of this wall.
Yeah. So he's standing at the top of the wall saying, I'm just holding a rope ladder. And there's a bit of a rush because on the other side of the road is a hospital and people are arriving for visiting hour. And Burke says, jump, jump, jump. And so Blake jumps, he's a 43-year-old man and he jumps off the top of the wall. Burke then tries to catch him. Blake twists away, breaks his wrist, and Burke stuffs him in a car, and they drive off 700 yards to the little bedsit that Burke has hired, and he's out of Wormwood Scrubs. As many, many dozens of prisoners escaped from British prisons in the 60s, it was not very difficult.
Okay, was this making headlines in the British papers?
Yeah, it's the biggest story sort of in the world, and everyone is looking for him. Burke and Blake watch TV, Blake in immense pain from his wrist. They watch the 9 o'clock news and clink a glass. Then they find him, the pacifists hide him in a flat in Hampstead, inevitably the place you would associate with British pacifists. And then that Christmas 1966, one of the pacifists with his wife and 2 small boys, they get a camper van. They create a secret compartment for Blake at the bottom of the camper van, and they drive it across on a Channel ferry through Belgium to West Berlin. In West Berlin, Blake walks up to an East Berlin border guard and says, "I want to talk with the Soviet command." And from there, he makes it to Moscow, where he spends the rest of his life.
Okay, I think we have a picture of him in the early days in Moscow where he had a lot of time to exercise.
Yeah, so he'd worked out a lot in prison. At this point, he doesn't have anything to do because the Soviets don't trust him. They think he's a triple agent, so they won't give him proper work. So he just keeps this working out that he does. And he holidays a bit in the USSR, but within a week of arriving there, he realizes communism doesn't work. I've given my whole life for an illusion. And now, I've left my wife and children behind. But he's a very bright spark. He's a positive bloke. He speaks good Russian. And so he makes himself a new life there. Very briefly on his Russian life, because I know we're coming towards the end of my banging on and we'll take a couple more questions. He marries, this is his mother. She comes to stay with him and helps him through those early years. She brings his suits, so he's dressed like a Westerner. And he marries a lovely Russian woman called Ida, who I met that day at the dacha. They have a son, Mika. And then in the 80s, Blake's British sons make contact with him. They begin to visit him. They reconnect with him. They love him as a father. And when he turns 90 in 2012, a few months after I met him, I gather from the New York Times that his British ex-wife actually came to visit him on his 90th birthday. So he told me the greatest happiness of his life was having a second family and reconnecting with his first family.
And he also sort of made up with his wife, his first wife.
Yeah. So she visits him in Russia at the end. He's very happy that she married another man who was also MI6. They had a marriage that lasted decades. So his sons had a good stepfather who they thought was their biological father until they were told as teenagers. And when I met Blake, that man had recently died, but Blake was very happy that his sons had been given a good life in a very conservative British family. One of the sons joined the Life Guards, a very traditional British regiment. Another became a vicar, so he kind of had the clerical path that Blake had wanted for himself. So they became conservative Britons, but they loved their daddy, the KGB agent.
And then in Moscow, he meets some of the other British spies.
Yeah, so he meets Philby and McLean. Burgess has already died of drink. And he and Philby, very secretive men, are quite suspicious of each other. And Blake is a bit contemptuous of Philby as a British gentleman, doesn't speak good Russian, can't adjust to Russia, reads the Times every day and does the Times crossword puzzle. And they fall out when Philby's son takes photographs of them all at Blake's dacha, the place I visited, and publishes them in the British press, which Blake knew would upset his wife and sons. And they fall out. Blake goes to his funeral in 1988 to pay his respects. Blake becomes the soulmate best friend of Donald Maclean. Maclean, who's a very kind of Protestant Scot, has some things in common with Blake, takes him into his think tank, this rather pointless think tank called IMEMO, where Blake becomes an expert on the Middle East and spends the last decades of his life trying to encourage the Soviets to make peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. And like everybody else who embarks on that particular project, does not get anywhere.
We have one more picture of Blake at home in Moscow.
Yeah, so by this point in his life, 1997, the Soviet Union has fallen. So he's lost his fatherland, the Netherlands. He's lost the British Empire. He's lost the Soviet Union. He's kind of given up on political ideals. He doesn't even believe in communism with a human face particularly anymore. And he's gone back to his religion, which I think was the creed that stayed most deeply with him. So on the wall, you see an Orthodox icon. He loved the Orthodox Church. And every Christmas he makes a British Christmas pudding from a recipe in the Times. He listens to the BBC World Service. He reads John le Carré until he goes essentially blind, he can't afford subscriptions to the British newspapers, but Donald Maclean has bequeathed him this British English library. And so he loves Britain. No, I wouldn't say he loves Britain. He admires Britain. He's very fond of Britain. He's very grateful to Brits who've steered his life. So he's a traitor to Britain, but he's a very Anglophile traitor.
Yeah. People are asking about two sets of questions. One is, did you learn all this in a 3-hour interview with Blake? Obviously not. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the research you did for the book. And also a totally separate question about remorse. Did you get the sense from Blake that he felt guilty about what he had done or felt badly about it?
Well, the first question, I mean, when I went to interview him that day in May 2012, I'd read his autobiography. I'd read a couple of things. I knew not much about him. And I walked out that day thinking, this is too much for a newspaper article. What do I do? And a couple of years later, I decided I have to turn this into a book. And I began reading. I read the various, I would say, error-ridden autobiographies that people had written, biographies of him that people had written in the 60s. And then I found the Stasi archive, which is really unique because the Stasi was the East German secret police. So secret polices do not generally make much of their archives public. Even MI6 only releases a very little bit. But the Stasi, because it's the secret police of a defunct country, everything's out there. It's all published. And Blake used to visit them in the 70s until 1980 to give talks. And they, of course, researched his life because that's what the Stasi did. So there's a wealth of information there. There are Dutch and German newspapers. This is one of his talks at the Stasi. He's the man sitting under the, on a secure course. What does it say? Aufsicherungskurs. Further forward in a secure course of the 9th party day of the SED, the East German ruling party. So one of these ludicrous 1970s gatherings of communist men. And there are articles in Dutch newspapers, in German newspapers. He's written about well in Germany as well. And so knowing that when you write about a spy and suddenly a double agent, you can never be totally sure of the truth. I researched everything I could. And I think what I did differently from previous biographies is I treated Blake as an international figure. You can't understand Blake from the British record. He spent, maybe 10% of his life in Britain. You have to go through other sources, other directions, treat him as an international figure. And then the issue of remorse. And when I said, do you have regrets? He said, yes, I have huge regrets. I have regrets for what I did to my wife and my sons. I have regrets for what I did to my colleagues in the British Secret Service. He always felt very guilty about that. And he said, other people whom I hurt, but well, there's nothing to be done about this anymore. What he always denied, I think even to himself, was that any agents had been put to death. He said, I always told the KGB, you can protect the Soviet Union, but you must not hurt these people. And of course, the KGB completely ignored that. And so we know that many of these people were executed and others spent many, many years in jail. I found this one East German who spent 16 years in jail. He'd been spying for the British until the West Germans bought him out in 1976. So I found a few of the people who he betrayed, what happened to them. But he denied to himself that these people had been killed. He told himself a happy story because at heart he was a peace-loving man. He was, weird to say, at heart a gentle man, and he couldn't admit to himself that he was a serial killer in effect.
I think we have some audio of your interview with Blake.
Yeah, this is just 1 minute. It's when we switch from Dutch to English. His wife shows up. You hear her talking in the background. She speaks French and English. And so as a courtesy to her, Blake starts speaking English to me. So you'll hear this outside the dacha. You hear the birds chirping. It's a really lovely place. Dacha given to him by the KGB.
Are you playing it?
Oh, sorry, that's why I was talking. I thought you were playing it. No, it's me. Sorry, everyone. This is the confusion that happens when you're partly co-hosting your own event. I have it here, one sec. Do I have it? Yes.
Yes, this, when my son was, yes, my son was 2 years old when we came here. But we started off just in the summer. And then gradually we started coming here in the winter as well because we like skiing in the woods here. And so then we eventually we moved in here all together when my son lives in my flat, in our flat in Moscow. So that's how it happened, gradually. Everything in life happens gradually.
Je spreekt Engels met een Nederlands accent.
Ja, ja, dat is waar. Dat is waar. Dat is waar.
So at the end, I say to him, "You speak Dutch with an English accent," and he says, "Yes, that's true." And I think you hear from his voice that he was not a real Englishman. He
speaks English with a Dutch accent, you mean?
Yeah. He speaks Russian. He spoke Russian with a Dutch accent as well.
Hmm.
So there we have The Happy Traitor. Years of my life, but I have to say I hugely enjoyed writing it.
One last question.